him to give you the first half of this introduction and to introduce to you Les Havens for this time.
Well, thank you, Jay. More than I could say. I'm very embarrassed, and I hope I can collect my wits enough to launch into this thing I wanted to do. This is the first of three or four rounds I'm going to give, and in a sense, are we all right? In a sense, it's a introduction. It consists of three parts. One is a historical review of the 50 years that I've been in the field, since mid-century to this time. A second is a discussion of the intellectual framework of those developments. And a third is a set of predictions, which I thought might amuse you. This thing talks back to me. What? What? Shanna, wonderful. Is it all right? Am I doing all right? I'll tell some stories, and some of you have heard me talk or in our conversations together will recognize these stories, I'm sure. As you perhaps already diagnosed me, I have entered what my mother called an anecdotage. A term she used about her own father in the latter years. So I hope these stories, if you're all familiar with them, you will listen with indulgence. At mid-century, mid-20th century, psychiatry was still a rural pursuit. It was in the state hospitals, in the private hospitals, all had been removed from the cities, even the suburbs. Psychiatry was not to be seen, essentially. And those hospitals were plagued by a central problem, which only those of you who work in emergency rooms will still have any real sense of: the problem of violence. Now, in those 50 years, psychiatry has moved from that rural, sequestered, isolated state, dominated by the fear of violence, into general hospitals like this one, into the community. It's become part of the culture of American life. You can't sit on a subway or in a bus and not hear people talking about projection and denial. And now in the last 10, 15 years, we've become, as you know, the Prozac nation. So that our impact on individuals and culture is today enormous. 100 years before 1950, the situation was even more remarkable. Probably the greatest woman in psychiatry, perhaps the greatest woman in America, with the exception possibly of Emily Dickinson, Dorothea Dix, was walking one day in Fall River and looked down at the ground and saw a grating over the earth and saw beneath the grating a human being, a mental patient. That's the way mental patients were kept. And she resolved, and in her indomitable way, she realized a resolution to create hospitals for the mentally ill. And she did that. Those hospitals wouldn't have gone bankrupt as they have if she'd had her way. Some of you know that she got a bill through Congress to give 50 million acres of land to the state hospitals. And Franklin Pierce, another one of our brilliant chief executives, vetoed it. So they started out with all the strikes against them. Today we still have mental patients beside grates, don't we? we've returned to using prisons as places for many of our patients. So the situation, although immeasurably better, has not changed in some very fundamental respects. I'm still too nervous to be enjoying this, and I've got to find some way to relax. Maybe I should just try to ignore you all and forget about you. As I said, the mental health work at the time I began it was dominated by the fear of violence. I went to medical school at Cornell, as Jay has said, and occasionally I'd go down to Saturday night to Bellevue Hospital, to the emergency room, and watch what they did when they had difficult problems. I was in New York Hospital, which is removed from all the realities of life, and so we never saw anything of this kind. But at Bellevue, you could see what was actually going on. And if what in those days was called a paranoid psychopath had broken up several bars on Broadway, they were brought in to the emergency room. They'd be brought in by 4 or 5 policemen, and they'd be handed over to 4 or 5 attendants. Not like our attendants today. Our attendants today read Dostoevsky and are concerned about mental health. These were all ex-bouncers, ex-policemen. And they took the patients and they slammed them on the ground and immediately administered electric shock treatment. And then they'd wait 3 or 4 hours when the person came around a little bit and give them another one. It was literally the only way you could manage violence. And sometimes even that didn't work. At Mass Metal in the 50s, still, mid-50s, we still sometimes would have to get the fire department in. They were better than the police department for this, to bring their tear gas in, to get patients out from bedding and springs that they'd hidden themselves behind and we couldn't reach them. Once we get them out with the tear gas, then we would apply the ECT. Now, for those of you for whom electric shock treatment is a kind of an anathema, that there was nothing else to do. There was nothing else to do. No medication would touch them. Can you hear me if I just stand higher down here? There was nothing you could do. Formaldehyde and oral hydrate are the main drugs used, ladled out, literally. But in order for them to have the effects that you needed to make life bearable, in order to have that, you had to essentially put them to sleep. And that was often a very dangerous procedure. But ECT, you could manage the patients that way. From the time of the introduction to ECT till about 1958, which was a good 30 years, we didn't realize that we were fracturing the spines of literally 40 to 60% of the patients who had unmodified ECT. It takes a long time to find out what you're doing to people, whether it's in psychoanalysis or ECT or medications in this business. Now, in the late 50s, the first time medications were discovered which could control this degree of violence. And of course, the one you know best is chlorpromazine or thorazine. But lithium, which was discovered in Australia, chlorpromazine was discovered in Paris. Lithium was helpful with the bipolar conditions, and of course the so-called schizophrenias, but any violence was manageable by chlorpromazine. Now this had an enormous effect because not only did it quiet things down without having to assault the patient so directly, but it also meant that the staff could relax. The staff could relax. The staff was not so afraid. And that double or triple the effects of the civilizing effects of that medication on the patients and the staff. Now, quieter, more civilized environment came other medications eventually, but it came into a psychiatry which was dominated by psychoanalysis. Now, why was psychoanalysis so important in American psychiatry at this time? For two reasons. One reason was that out of World War II had come an experience with the treatment of neuroses, combat neuroses. And it was realized that some kind of abreactive process, some kind of supportive abreactive process was often magical in resolving these conditions. And so many of the early leaders of the 50s and the 60s had essentially been principal parties to those discoveries in World War II. Now, Hitler was also responsible for another part of this, because the disappearance of the psychoanalytic community from Europe was brought about in part by Hitler. And they came not to all over the world, but they came to America in large numbers. Now this was an extraordinary gift to us, although the gift was not always meted out to us with that degree of collegiality and joviality we would have hoped, since we'd already saved them in Europe. There was a certain contempt for American culture, which came with this, as well as contempt for American medicine, which was part of this psychoanalytic transplantation. And of course, we deserved it. We deserved it. Because you forget that America only came on the world stage in a cultural sense, with people like Jackson Pollock after that period. We only began to compete intellectually, spiritually, artistically later. But nevertheless, they had the contempt. But we paid them back. We paid them back. Because we took some of their greatest figures, Heinz Kohut, Franz Alexander, who ended up in Chicago, and Chicago did its thing to the psychoanalysts. It made Heinz Kohut, who had been quite orthodox, really almost an existentialist. It made dear old Franz Alexander, who had been very orthodox in Berlin, a figure that you might almost call a relational psychoanalyst, which is a much later development. So we paid them back eventually. But both those people were, of course, exiled from the establishment of psychoanalysis at that time. But this was the climate that I came into at that time. And it was exciting. It was an attention to individuals. Freud was the reason I'd gone to medical school, because he was so interesting to read. So that it was, for all its limitations and its orthodoxy, it was an exciting time. And then something else happened. This time not from Chicago, but from St. Louis. In St. Louis, two workers, Goodwin and Bouzet, decided that psychiatry was on the wrong path, and that we should go back to the discussion of syndromes and symptoms and make diagnoses. Make diagnoses. And this movement gathered strength. It gathered strength, I think, principally from the emergence of more and more medications. Because when this movement of diagnosis dominated psychiatry, as it had in the first quarter of this century I'm talking about, then Kreplin, who was responsible more than anyone else for the development of that, his selling point was not that they had a treatment for his conditions, which he would outline, but instead he thought that if you could be specific enough about the picture of the condition, it would point to a cause, to etiology. Now that wasn't true. And that idea was more or less destroyed by 1910, 1912. But it persisted, that hope persisted still. But now the hope was that we could find a treatment, that is, chemical treatment specific to these different conditions. I leave to your probably better judgment than mine how close we've come to that. But of course, again, chlorpromazine, on the one hand, thorazine, and lithium pointed in that direction because they seem to be centered on schizophrenia and bipolar. So this was not a foolish notion, and indeed it may prove to be a much more satisfactory notion than some of us believe at the moment.